He was a pilot, but the sky was never his real limit. Behind that calm title was one of the most dangerous stories in American history. A man now classified as the biggest drug smuggler the United States has ever seen. The numbers alone are terrifying. Drugs worth nearly $20 billion. 20 billion. Moved right under the government's nose, without anyone noticing. And here's the strange part. He didn't look like a drug dealer. No gangs, no criminal image, no life in the shadows. Instead, he was a polished businessman, owner of a successful company, moving confidently among politicians and powerful figures. A man who was known, respected, trusted. Trusted to the point where the President of the United States himself knew him. So how does a man with such a clean image run one of the most complex and dangerous drug operations in history without raising a single red flag? And the story doesn't stop there. At one point, he was actually arrested. He was charged with drug trafficking. He sat in a courtroom just like any other defendant. But what happened next defies logic. Between court sessions, this man walked out and continued smuggling drugs, as if the entire justice system was nothing more than a minor appointment on his calendar. Then came the biggest shock of all. In the end, he walked free. No conviction, no sentence, nothing. So how did he escape? How did he manipulate the law with such unbelievable confidence? How did he live in public as a respected citizen, while secretly running a massive criminal empire? This is not an ordinary crime story. This is the story of a man who fooled the government, fooled the law, and fooled everyone. And what comes next is far more dangerous than you can imagine. So let's dive deep into the details that make this story truly unforgettable. Our story takes place in 1983, right in the heart of the early 80s, a time when drug smuggling into the United States was at its absolute peak. Colombian drug cartels, especially the Medellin cartel led by Pablo Escobar, were at the height of their power. And they had a clear strategy. They actively recruited American citizens to work as smugglers on their behalf. On the other side, the U.S. government had reached its limit. Authorities escalated the fight to the highest level and declared an all-out war on drug trafficking. Leading that war was the Drug Enforcement Administration, the DEA. Every resource was mobilized to stop what was becoming a national bleeding wound. Back then, the smuggling method was almost always the same. Small private planes, piloted by American smugglers. They would fly to Colombia, pick up the shipment from the cartel, then fly straight back into the United States. Once the drugs landed, distribution networks inside the country took over, spreading and selling everything. It didn't take long for the DEA to identify Florida as the main entry point. Geography made it inevitable. Florida is the closest U.S. state to Colombia, and those small planes had limited range, tiny fuel tanks. They had no choice but to take the shortest possible route, and that route almost always led through Florida. As a result, Florida turned into a full-scale battlefield. The DEA began monitoring the state intensely, and over time, they noticed a strange pattern among smugglers. Gold chains, luxury watches, the same style of clothes, the same sunglasses, same look, same taste, like carbon copies of one another. Using that pattern, the DEA arrested a large number of smugglers. Eventually, Florida became the state with the highest concentration of DEA agents in the entire country. But even that wasn't enough, so they built a massive surveillance network. Ground-based radar systems spread across all of Florida, with special focus on coastal areas. airborne radar units mounted on patrol aircraft, flying non-stop, day and night. Even the U.S. Navy joined in, using radar systems from warships to monitor border zones. Land, air, sea. Everything was under watch, and as their tactics evolved, the DEA stopped arresting smugglers immediately. Instead, they let them continue. They followed quietly, tracked every move, waiting until the smuggler led them straight to the distribution network inside the U.S. Then, one single strike. Smuggler, dealer, drugs, money, all taken down at once. At that point, drug smuggling had become extremely dangerous. Many smugglers were arrested. Others walked away from the business completely. But, in the middle of this airtight system, amid radars, planes, ships, and agents, one man made a different choice. He chose to challenge everyone. A man who smuggled more drugs than dozens of smugglers combined. Shipments worth billions of dollars. The DEA knew he existed. They knew he was active. They even assigned a special task force to hunt him down. His case was their highest priority. And yet, they couldn't reach him. So who was this man? How did he break through the most advanced surveillance network in American history? And how did he remain invisible for all those years? The real reason authorities struggled to reach this man was simple. They were looking in the wrong place. This smuggler wasn't operating out of Florida, and he didn't look anything like the criminals the DEA was used to chasing. No gold chains, no flashy lifestyle, no loud behavior, nothing that drew attention. The complete opposite. His name was Rick Leadez. On the surface, he was a respected businessman, a model American citizen, living a quiet, comfortable life in Scranton, Pennsylvania. Rick was socially well-connected. He befriended politicians, did business with influential figures. He even had direct connections to former U.S. President Gerald Ford. Anyone who met him, anyone who shook his hand, would never, for even a second, suspect he had anything to do with drug smuggling. But what no one knew was that Rick had something rare and dangerous. He was a top-tier aviation expert, a pilot, and an aircraft engineer at the highest level. His obsession with flying started early. At just 6 years old, his dream was already clear. He wanted to be a pilot. The kind of kid whose dream never changes, and Rick was exactly that kind of kid. Amazingly, he earned his private pilot's license while still in high school. After graduation, he enrolled in aviation college and studied everything: flying aircraft, engineering, flight systems, performance limits, hidden weaknesses. He didn't just graduate knowing how to fly. He graduated as an expert. Not long after, Rick launched his own business. He founded a company called Air America. The company specialized in modifying small private aircraft. The modifications were subtle, but incredibly smart. Fuel tanks were expanded, allowing planes to fly much longer distances without stopping. But more fuel meant more weight. So wings had to be reinforced, landing gear upgraded, sometimes even engines replaced. Everything was done with extreme precision. Clean work, legal work, professional work, and the company's reputation spread fast. Business boomed, money flowed in, and with it, Rick's social status skyrocketed. He became known in powerful circles. He befriended police chiefs, built relationships with the state governor. He flew with them, met with them, discussed investments, development, and the future of the city. Rick became a regular guest at official events and high-profile parties. And at one of those events, he met the President of the United States himself. From the outside, his life looked perfect. Professional success, powerful connections, social respect, a spotless reputation. Everything moved smoothly until 1980. And that's when the true face of this story finally began to surface. In 1980, a brutal economic crisis hit the entire world, and the United States was one of the hardest hit countries. Rick's company didn't survive the storm untouched. It took a direct hit. Almost overnight, his regular clients disappeared. Business owners, corporate executives, wealthy private pilots. The people who depended on his services simply vanished. Orders stopped coming in. Work slowed to a crawl, and day after day, the company began bleeding money. But as that world faded, a new kind of customer appeared. Very different customers. Hard faces, cold eyes, suspicious behavior. They didn't act like businessmen. They acted like criminals. Their requests were specific, repeated, and deeply concerning. Aircraft modifications that included hidden storage compartments, smartly designed spaces, so well concealed that even a detailed inspection would struggle to find them. Requests like that didn't require much intelligence to understand their purpose. Rick knew. He was certain these planes would be used to smuggle illegal cargo. But reality was harsher than principles. A collapsing business. Employees' salaries that still had to be paid. Mounting debts. All of it pushed him to say yes. And so for a period of time, Rick found himself working with these suspicious clients. Not because he wanted to, but because he was trying to keep his company alive. Until something happened that he never saw coming. One day, after Rick and his team finished modifying a client's aircraft, the man refused to pay in cash. Instead, he handed Rick a bag filled with drug pills, coldly telling him their value was higher than the cost of the work. And he made it clear. He wasn't paying a single dollar. Rick was trapped. He needed the money, and the client refused to pay. With no other option, Rick took the bag, hoping he could sell its contents and turn it into cash to cover at least part of his losses. But here's the irony. The first person Rick tried to sell those pills to was an undercover police officer. Within moments, he was arrested. The drugs were confiscated, and Rick was taken in for interrogation. During questioning, authorities quickly realized something. Rick wasn't a professional drug dealer. He wasn't a gang member. He wasn't a criminal mastermind. He was a struggling businessman who had made a terrible decision under financial pressure. They didn't see him as dangerous, and that's when the DEA stepped in. They offered him a deal. No prison, no criminal record. In exchange for one thing. He would become an informant. His mission? Report suspicious clients, suspicious requests, any illegal activity happening inside his company. Rick agreed. He returned to work, but this time, with his eyes wide open. He watched, listened, noticed details, and over time, a shocking picture began to form. These clients, they weren't small-time smugglers. They were making millions of dollars from a single flight. While Rick, with all his knowledge and expertise, was barely surviving. And that's when a dangerous thought started creeping into his mind. Why them? Why not him? Why were they making millions while he, the man with the real skill and control, was struggling just to stay afloat? From that moment on, Rick stopped seeing himself as a victim of the economic crisis and started seeing himself as a potential player in a game far bigger than anything he had ever imagined. In 1981, Rick managed, through one of his clients, to make contact with a drug smuggling ring based in Tampa, Florida. And at that time, as everyone already knew, Florida was the beating heart of drug trafficking operations. Its geographic proximity to Colombia made it the perfect gateway into the United States. The Tampa crew made Rick an offer, a tempting one. Several smuggling runs, big money, and the role was clear. Rick would be the pilot, the smuggler, and the man fully responsible for the entire operation. At that moment, his company was standing on the edge of bankruptcy, so the decision wasn't as difficult as it might sound. Rick accepted immediately, convincing himself of just one thing. This is temporary. I'll make some money, save my company, and then I'll walk away for good. But reality had something else in store. From his very first real interaction with the gang, Rick realized something terrifying. They were a mess. Most of them were addicts, undisciplined, unreliable. You couldn't trust them with anything. The planes themselves were a disaster. Extra fuel tanks installed openly inside the cabin, drugs thrown in randomly, no calculations, no concern for weight, no balance, no safety. And worst of all, the gang's base was in Florida itself, the most heavily monitored state by the DEA, packed with radars, packed with undercover agents. And yet, on his very first run, Rick did what others couldn't. He took off, avoided the radars, completed the mission, and returned to Florida without being detected. It wasn't luck. It was experience, precision, and intelligent planning. He earned every dollar he was paid, and it was a big amount, enough to actually make a difference for his struggling company. In total, Rick completed 3 smuggling operations with the Tampa gang. Then he made a firm decision. He was done. Each run was more dangerous than the one before it, and the gang's recklessness had become a direct threat to his life. Rick was convinced this was the end of his journey in smuggling. What he didn't know was that his work had not gone unnoticed. His professionalism, his calm, his completely different performance compared to other smugglers. The word traveled upward, not to small-time criminals, but to the real power players in Colombia. Not long after, Rick received a call. The callers were connected to the Medellin Cartel, the infamous organization led by Pablo Escobar, and the man who requested the meeting was no ordinary figure. His name was Jorge Ochoa, a founding partner of the Medellin Cartel, one of Escobar's closest allies, and a man responsible for one of the largest shares of cocaine entering the United States at the time. This was the top of the pyramid, and he personally wanted to sit down with Rick. They met. They talked for a long time, and it was obvious. Ochoa saw something different in him. His skills, his experience, his way of thinking. All of it made Rick the perfect candidate. This time, the offer wasn't respectable. It was worth millions. Ochoa promised him a fortune that would change his life forever. He said it plainly. "We will make you rich, richer than you ever imagined." Rick was still under financial pressure, still fighting to save his company, still needing every dollar he could get. He agreed. But before the meeting ended, Ochoa looked him straight in the eyes and delivered a single warning. No polish, no softness. If you ever cheat us, we will find you, wherever you are, and we will kill you. Rick understood exactly what kind of world he had just stepped into. He knew there was no easy way back, and still, he was ready to go all the way. Rick's first real challenge came down to one dangerous question. How do you fly directly from Pennsylvania to Colombia? The distance between the two was nearly 5,000 kilometers, and small aircraft? Even at their absolute best, they could barely reach 1,500 kilometers. That's why most smugglers operated out of Florida. It was the closest point, and even then, they had to carry extra fuel, or stop at risky locations to refuel. But Rick wanted something completely different. One flight, one straight line, from Pennsylvania to Columbia. No stops, and that meant one thing only: modifications that had never been done this way before. Rick chose a plane he knew like the back of his hand. The Cessna 310, one of the aircraft models he had worked on the most throughout his career. Its normal range was about 1,500 kilometers. The first issue was fuel. The plane's original fuel capacity was roughly 2,000 gallons. Rick didn't just increase it, he tripled it, pushing it to nearly 6,000 gallons. But unlike other smugglers, who openly placed fuel barrels inside the cabin, making the plane suspicious at first glance, Rick took a far more brilliant route. He used heavy-duty rubber fuel bags and hid them inside the aircraft's structure itself, in the nose of the plane, beneath the floor, inside cargo compartments, along the wings. Not a single empty space was left unused, and with his precise engineering knowledge, he built a system that allowed fuel to be consumed evenly from all tanks at the same time. Because even a slight imbalance meant instability, and instability meant falling out of the sky. But all that fuel created a new problem: weight. So Rick reinforced the wings, strengthened the landing gear, and completely replaced the engine with a more powerful one capable of carrying this insane load. And the most impressive part? Every modification was clean, precise, and completely unnoticeable. Anyone looking at the plane from the outside would swear it was normal. No one would ever imagine it could fly 5,000 kilometers non-stop. But Rick didn't stop there. Inside the aircraft, he installed a special device capable of detecting DEA radar systems and aerial patrols. Then he went even further. He managed to reach a corrupt customs official, paid him off, and got access to radar locations and patrol schedules. So he knew exactly when to pass and when to disappear. And the plan didn't end there. Rick built an encrypted radio communication network stretching along the entire route between Pennsylvania and Columbia, a system based on coded signals, far away from phones that could be monitored. Every step was calculated. Every detail was planned. And the most dangerous part? Throughout all of this, Rick remained in constant contact with the DEA agents themselves, the same agents who had once recruited him as an informant. He spoke to them daily. Sometimes, he even gave them real information, helping them take down small-time smugglers, until they trusted him completely. None of them knew that the man cooperating with them was secretly preparing the largest airborne smuggling operation they would ever face. After 3 full months of intense planning and precise calculations, the day finally came. Rick took off on his first real mission, a direct route from Pennsylvania to Columbia, a flight that lasted 13 non-stop hours, nearly 5,000 kilometers covered in one stretch. No landings, no refueling, not even once. When he reached Columbia, specifically the agreed-upon location, there was no airport in the traditional sense. Just a rough dirt strip, barely leveled, more like an open field. The cartel members were already waiting. The moment the wheels touched the ground, they rushed in. They began loading the cargo and refueling the plane for the return trip. Rick sat there, catching his breath after the exhausting flight. But his mind never stopped working. He was calculating everything: the plane's weight after loading, the length of the takeoff run, whether the aircraft could even lift again. Because the heavier the plane, the longer the runway it needs. And the problem? This runway was far from flat. It was uneven, full of bumps and dips. and at the very end, dense trees. According to Rick's calculations, takeoff would happen at the last possible second, and that's exactly what happened. The plane struggled, it dragged, it hesitated. For a moment, it almost failed. But right at the edge, just as Rick predicted, the aircraft finally lifted off. His new engine proved it wasn't installed for nothing. It carried the extra weight and saved the mission. On the way back, Rick didn't follow the same route. He chose a longer path, but one farther away from radar systems and surveillance zones. He could afford the detour. He had loaded more fuel than he actually needed. But halfway through the flight, the danger alarm went off. The radar inside the plane lit up. Another aircraft was tracking him, a naval surveillance plane patrolling the border area. If it got any closer, this story would end right there. Outrunning it wasn't an option. He was already visible on their radar, and any confrontation would mean gunfire and getting shot down. In that moment, Rick had only one choice. A thunderstorm was approaching the area. Entering it was a serious risk, but staying outside it meant life in prison. He didn't hesitate. He changed course instantly and flew straight into the heart of the storm. Lightning, violent winds, severe turbulence. But the radars failed, and the Navy aircraft refused to follow him into the storm. The battle with the weather lasted nearly 2 hours, until Rick finally emerged, still flying. Using his experience, he dropped to an extremely low altitude to avoid radar detection. Then he made another brilliant move. He headed toward an abandoned airstrip. He didn't land completely. He just touched the ground for a brief moment, then took off again immediately. The goal? To make the radar data show that the plane had taken off from inside the country, not that it had just returned from a transcontinental flight. After that, he flew straight to Scranton Airport. He contacted the control tower, logged his arrival officially, and reported it as a short domestic flight in the official records. There was nothing suspicious. The authorities were watching Florida. It never crossed anyone's mind that a single smuggler could modify a small aircraft to fly this insane distance and come back without anyone noticing. And just like that, the first mission was over. But it was only the beginning. The moment Rick made it back to his hometown safely, someone was already waiting for him. These weren't ordinary smugglers. They were U.S. distributors, the final link in the chain. They took the entire shipment from him. Nearly 1 full ton of cocaine for a single trip. Rick was paid $1 million in cash. The cartel leaders were completely stunned, not just because he succeeded, but how he did it. The method, the precision, the professionalism, everything about him was different. So it didn't stop at one flight. Within that same year, Rick began running multiple smuggling operations back to back. Each time he transported hundreds of kilograms of cocaine, and on every single run, the payment was never less than $1 million. Sometimes, much more. The money started pouring in, real wealth, far beyond anything he had ever dreamed of before. And over time, Rick stopped working alone. He expanded, built his own network, brought in other pilots to work under him. The number of flights multiplied, but one thing never changed. Everything went through Rick. No plane was used unless he personally supervised every modification. No mission was flown unless he confirmed that every single detail was perfectly calculated. Clean work, professional, no room for chance. And with repeated success, caution began to fade. That's human nature. At first, fear controls you. Then, with repetition, Fear turns into confidence, and confidence turns into routine. Rick grew comfortable in his new world, so comfortable, in fact, that the cartel leaders themselves sometimes asked him to slow down. Yes, he was moving the product faster than they could produce it. Production couldn't keep up with smuggling. He even joked with his pilots, saying, "We're not smugglers anymore. We're express delivery for drugs." And the strangest part? Throughout all that time, Rick never lost a single flight. No plane crashed, no shipment disappeared, no operation was exposed. In the smuggling world, that's not normal. And that's exactly why the cartel leaders valued him so highly. They often rewarded him with more money than originally agreed, because quite simply, he saved them time. He reduced losses. He minimized risk. But the most dangerous game was happening somewhere else. All those years, Rick still maintained a close relationship with DEA agents. They never suspected him for a second. They believed he was their man on the inside, that he was cooperating honestly. And the truth? He was giving them information, but carefully selected information. Tips that helped them. Tips that took down other smugglers, but never led back to him, so in their eyes, Rick was a valuable source, deep inside the criminal world, while in reality, he was the largest drug smuggler in the entire country. But as always, the highest peaks never last forever. In 1984, something went wrong, something no one expected. The disaster began. Remember the smuggling crew in Florida? The same crew Rick worked with during his very first operations? That crew collapsed completely. And the surprise? Rick went down with them. He wasn't arrested because of his massive current operations, not because of the intercontinental flights, but because of his old history with them. In total, 15 people were arrested. Rick was one of them. All of them were transferred to the state of Florida for trial, since the smuggling crimes they were charged with had taken place there. During the court hearings, Rick admitted to something dangerous. Yes, he acknowledged that he had smuggled drugs, but he claimed the truth was far more complicated. He argued that everything he did was part of his cooperation with the DEA, that entering this world was a way to gain deeper access to major smuggling networks inside the United States. And the most shocking part? Rick didn't just talk. He actually convinced DEA agents themselves to come to court and testify on his behalf. Those agents were fully convinced that Rick was their man on the inside, that he was putting himself at risk just to feed them information. They testified that he was an excellent informant, that his intelligence was real, useful, and valuable. But while Rick was playing this game inside the courtroom, he was living a completely different nightmare behind the scenes. He was terrified. Not of the judge, not of prison, but of the cartel bosses in Colombia. He knew that if word ever reached them that he was cooperating with the DEA, they would see him as a traitor. And in their world, the punishment for betrayal is well known. So Rick made a decision. He chose to walk a razor-thin line, with unbelievable boldness. During the trial itself, between court sessions, Rick was flying real smuggling missions. Yes, the man was on trial for drug trafficking, and on the weekends, he was flying out to smuggle more drugs. Was it courage, madness, or fear of the cartel? Call it whatever you want. What he did had never happened before. The trial lasted 11 weeks, and during those 11 weeks, Rick carried out 11 full smuggling flights. He made nearly $13 million while sitting in the defendant's seat. Then came the verdict. Out of the 15 defendants, Rick was the only one who walked free. completely acquitted, thanks to the testimony of DEA agents. A story that doesn't even sound real in Hollywood movies. But success always has a price. Rick now had tens of millions of dollars, and money like that can't be used openly. It needed to be cleaned. That's when a new name entered the story. Michael Coffey, a banker, a man who specialized in moving money and hiding its true origin. With Michael's help, Rick began transferring his money to accounts outside the United States, then bringing it back in through methods that looked legal and legitimate. Of course, for a very large commission. And it worked. Most of Rick's fortune was successfully laundered, but as Rick had learned time and time again, every time he thought things had finally settled, a new problem appeared, and this one was more dangerous than anything before. This time, the problem Rick faced didn't come from the authorities. It came from inside his own operation. One of the pilots working for him was named Jim Cooper. On one flight, Jim was returning from Colombia fully loaded with drugs. When he reached the landing site, a local dealer was waiting for him in his car to pick up the shipment. But what happened next was a complete disaster. As the plane was coming in to land, the dealer's car accidentally drove onto the runway. The plane hit it. The dealer was killed instantly. The incident was reported immediately. Police arrived on the scene, and when they searched the aircraft, they discovered the cargo. In that moment, the case changed completely. It was no longer a tragic accident. It became a major drug smuggling case, plus involuntary manslaughter. Jim was arrested on the spot. After the initial investigation, he was given the right to make one phone call. The first name that came to his mind was Rick. When Rick heard the news, he panicked. He had options. He could have tried to save Jim. He could have paid for his silence. He could have helped him escape. But Rick made the worst possible decision. He abandoned him completely. Jim understood the message clearly. His boss had left him to face his fate alone, and now he was staring at 30 to 40 years in prison. In that moment, Jim made his decision. He chose to make a deal with the authorities in exchange for reduced charges or a lighter sentence. He would tell them everything, and he did. He exposed Rick, the flights, the planes, the smuggling methods, and the company, Air America. But the authorities didn't move right away. One man's confession wasn't enough. They needed solid proof. So they launched a massive investigation. Invoices, phone records, travel logs, bank accounts, everything connected to Rick and his company. An investigation of that size takes time. And Rick, he felt the danger. He knew his arrest was only a matter of time. So he moved fast. He transferred $30 million to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. Then he got on his plane and fled there himself. His choice wasn't random. The Cayman Islands had no extradition treaty with the United States. But this time, Rick's calculations were wrong. U.S. authorities followed the money. They tracked him down and alerted local officials on the island. It's true, there was no extradition treaty, but local authorities decided Rick was dangerous, a troublemaker, and not welcome. In 1986, he was arrested, taken straight to the airport, and from there, handed over to U.S. authorities. When Rick returned to the United States, the real investigation began. The charges were terrifying. If combined, he was facing up to 345 years in prison. So he chose his final option: full cooperation. He revealed where his money was hidden. Authorities seized over $21 million in cash. Massive amounts. stacks of money. Then he told them everything, every operation, every route, every pilot, every man in his organization. One by one, they all fell, and they all went to prison with varying sentences. As for Rick, because of his full cooperation, he received a reduced sentence, just 8.5 years, an incredibly short time when you remember that he brought tens of tons of cocaine into the United States, drugs that destroyed thousands of families and countless lives. But from the authorities' perspective, the information he provided was more valuable than keeping him behind bars longer. And here, our story ends. The story of a man who lived 2 lives, a respected businessman in public, and the biggest drug smuggler in American history in secret. An ending just as strange as the journey itself. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, support us with a like, and check out the stories on your screen right now. Visit the channel. You'll find incredible, thrilling stories that are absolutely worth your time. Until we meet again in the next story.